Solving quadratic equations. In this video, we're going to talk about the square root property with me, Catherine. The square root property is actually pretty straightforward. Whenever you have a square, like x squared, equal to a number, all we have to do is take the square root of both sides. Let's look at the first one. X squared equals 25. Using the square root property, we're going to take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5. Why is it plus or minus 5? Well, let me show you. Whatever squared has to equal 25. And that's okay because 5 squared is 25. But if we put negative 5 in there, it also equals 25. Negative 5 squared is 25. That's why we have two answers for this one, plus or minus 5. Let's look at the next one. This one, we have 6x squared equals 294. Now we have a little problem with this one because the x squared isn't by itself. But guess what? We're going to make it by itself by dividing by 6. 6x squared divided by 6 gives us our x squared, and that's what we want. 294 divided by 6 is 49. Then we're just going to follow the property. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 49 is going to turn out to be plus or minus 7. And it's the same reason. 6 times 7 squared is 294. Try it on your calculator. It's also true when I put negative 7 in there. 6 times negative 7 squared is 294. Let's look at some more. Z squared equals negative 23. Well, this one is in the form x squared equals k. So all we're going to do is take the square root of both sides. So now we have z equals plus or minus the square root of negative 23. Here's where all the properties we've been learning come into play. The square root of negative 23 is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times 23, which is plus or minus I, the square root of 23. This one is really hard to check, so we're not even going to attempt it. But trust me, the answer for this one is plus or minus I, the square root of 23. X squared plus 7 equals 0. It's not in our form yet, but we can make it by just subtracting 7 on both sides. Now we have x squared equals negative 7, and it's ready for our square root property. Take the square root of both sides. We end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 7, which is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times 7. The square root of negative 1 is I, so our answer is going to be x equals plus or minus I, the square root of 7. Let's look at the last one. This one actually has a couple problems in it. First of all, 3x squared is not by itself, so we're going to make it by subtracting 9. But we still have a problem because we don't want the 3 times x squared. It doesn't look like our property. All we have to do is, divide by 3 on both sides. So now we have x squared equals negative 3. And it looks just like we want for our property. We take the square root of both sides. The square root of negative 3 is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times 3. The square root of negative 1 is I, so we end up with x equals plus or minus I, the square root of 3. Let's look at a couple more. For the first one here, we have x plus 2 squared equals 63. It might not look like it, but it's actually in the form we want, x squared. That means something squared equals k. In this case, the something squared is x plus 2. So all we have to do is take the square root of both sides. That gives us x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 63. At this point, some instructors will say, hey, let's get the x by itself by subtracting 2. I like to look at the square root first and say, is there a perfect square in 63? And break it down from there. And that's actually what we're going to do. And yes, there is a perfect square in 63. It's 9. And the square root of 9 is 3. So we end up with plus or minus 3 times the square root of 7. Now let's look on the left side. What's the opposite of adding to? it's subtracting 2. I want to point out something else. Do you notice how I wrote subtract 2 way on the right? That's because I want to make sure I'm not confused, because plus or minus 3, the square root of 7, and negative 2 are not like terms. So we're going to end up with x equals negative 2 plus or minus 2, the square root of 7. Now this is a correct answer, but for some instructors in some books, they want you to rewrite it as 2 separate answers. If you need to rewrite it as 2 separate answers, you will have x equals negative 2 plus 2 the square root of 7, or x equals 2 minus 2 the square root of 7. The second example here looks very similar to the first one, except we're taking 3 times that something squared. We need to get rid of the 3, and the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So we're going to divide by 3 on both sides. Now it looks like our x squared equals k. That something is x minus 5 squared. We're going to take the square root of both sides, and we end up with x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 12. I mentioned it in the last one. Some instructors want to get x by itself, so they'll add 5 right away. I don't. I like to mess with the square root first. And is there a perfect square in 12? Yep, there is. It's 4. So the square root of 12 is the same thing as saying the square root of 4 times 3. And the square root of 4 is 2. So now we have x minus 5 equals plus or minus 2 the square root of 3. We still need to solve for x. So we're going to have to add 5 to both sides. Once again, just like the last one, I like to put the plus 5 on the end because I don't want to get confused that those might be like terms, because they're not. That means we end up with x equals 5 plus or minus 2 the square root of 3. This is a perfect answer. But once again, some instructors like you to break it up. And some online programs like you to break them up too. So for this one, x equals 5 plus 2 the square root of 3, or x equals 5 minus 2 the square root of 3. It is now self-quiz time. You're going to pause the video, solve for x, and then press play to check. For the first one, it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to take the square root of both sides. So we have x plus 7 equals plus or minus the square root of 81. And the square root of 81 is 9. Okay. Now we want to get x by itself. So we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. Now here's something interesting. Even though 9 and 7 are considered like terms, the plus or minus 9 in front gives us 2 possible answers. And let me show you. We have x equals negative 7 plus or minus 9. That is, x equals negative 7 plus 9, which is 2, or x equals negative 7 minus 9, which is negative 16. Just like the other ones, this one has 2 answers, but these answers are real numbers, 2 and negative 16. The next one was a little tricky because we need to do a bunch of stuff. First of all, the x squared is not by itself, so we're going to subtract 25 from both sides. This is going to give us 5x squared equals negative 5. But that still gives us a problem because we don't have x squared by itself, which is easy to fix because we're just going to divide by 5. That gives us x squared equals negative 1. We take the square root of both sides, and that's going to give us x equals plus or minus I. And that's the answer. The only way to get good is to practice, practice, practice. If you like this video, pin me to Pinterest. Make sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss another exciting episode with me, Catherine. Until then, so I hope to see you in the next video.